My son's fingers closed around my wrist so hard I felt heat before pain. Not the sharp kind, something deeper, heavier. His face was inches from mine, eyes wide, voice cracking as he shouted, "Give me your pension." The words hit harder than his grip. I had carried him for 9 months, rocked him through fevers, buried his scraped knees in kisses. And there he was, shaking me like I was a locked drawer refusing to open. "You're a burden," he spat, breath sour with panic. "You just sit on money you don't even deserve." That was the moment something inside me went still. Not fear, not anger. A cold, quiet understanding. The kind that tells you a line has been crossed and can never be redrawn. My wrist throbbed as he yanked me toward the living room, demanding a key he believed would unlock my life. I didn't scream. I didn't fight him. I just looked at my own child and saw a stranger who believed force could replace respect. He thought money made him strong. He had no idea the law already knew his name. If this happened in your family, would you see it coming? Subscribe now. People think danger announces itself. It doesn't. It arrives wearing a familiar face, using a voice you once trusted. It calls you mom. It tells you it's entitled to what you earned. And when you say no, it shows you exactly how little your years of sacrifice matter. He finally released me and stormed out, slamming the door so hard the walls trembled. I stood there alone, clutching my wrist, listening to my own heartbeat fill the house my husband and I built with love. The silence afterward was louder than his shouting. I knew, standing in that quiet, that this wasn't over. It was only changing shape. I also knew something else. The police would come. Not today. Not loudly. And not for me. They wouldn't knock on my door because I wasn't the one who crossed the law. I was the one who learned how to use it. You might be wondering how a mother survives making that choice. How she lives with turning her own child in. I asked myself the same question as I eased ice around my swelling wrist and replayed his words again and again. Burden. As if my life had an expiration date tied to his bank account. As if love meant surrender. Here's what no one tells you. The hardest part isn't the fear. It's accepting that protecting yourself doesn't make you cruel. It makes you alive. The police car would arrive soon enough. When it did, it would stop 2 houses down. I would watch from my window, heart steady, hands no longer shaking. I would say nothing. Because by then, I would finally understand something my son never did. Power doesn't come from grabbing. It comes from standing still and letting consequences catch up. And when you hear what happened after that knock, the one meant for him, you'll understand why silence was the loudest answer I could give. My name is Elara Sterling. Most people call me Ellie. I'm 78 years old, and I've lived in Willow Creek, Ohio, long enough to watch the maple trees on my street grow taller than the houses. This home, the white 2-story with the narrow porch and the swing that creaks when the wind picks up, is not just where I live. It's where my life settled after decades of work, compromise, laughter, and loss. My husband, Arthur, and I bought this place when Quentin was still small enough to hide under the dining table during thunderstorms. Arthur worked at the factory for more than 30 years, clocking in before dawn, coming home with grease under his nails and stories about men who complained too much and machines that never listened. He wasn't a man of big speeches. He showed love by fixing things, by keeping promises, by making sure the bills were paid even when money felt tight. When Arthur passed, what he left me wasn't wealth. It was security. My social security check, his union pension, and a house with no mortgage. Enough to buy groceries without panic. Enough to keep the heat on in winter. Enough to tend my small garden out back and replace a leaking roof without begging anyone for help. Enough to live with dignity. I never asked for more than that. For a long time, Quentin said he admired that life. He told people his parents were solid, that we'd done things the right way. I believed him. I believed the pride in his voice was real. I believed that the values Arthur and I lived by had taken root in him too. But admiration can curdle into resentment when patience runs out. Quentin was never content with steady ground. He chased results that came fast and loud. Big ideas. Big promises. Bigger risks. Every few years there was a new plan, each one presented as the answer to everything that came before it. When those plans failed, he always landed on his feet, or so it looked from the outside. New car, new clothes, dinners at places I only saw on television. What I didn't see at first was the debt holding it all together. After Arthur died, Quentin started coming around more often. At first, it felt comforting. He'd ask how I was sleeping, whether my joints were acting up, whether I needed anything from the store. Then, slowly, the conversations shifted. A late payment here, a short-term gap there. Always temporary, always urgent, always framed as something that would pay off once the next deal came through. I told myself this was what family did. You helped. You trusted. You didn't keep score. The house didn't change, but the feeling inside it did. Visits became tense. Questions felt loaded. I noticed how often his eyes drifted toward my desk, my file cabinet, the places where important papers lived. I noticed how rarely he asked about my life unless it connected to money. Still, I held on to the version of him I raised. The boy who once cried because he thought he'd broken my favorite mug. The teenager who promised he'd take care of me one day. I told myself this phase would pass. That stress was making him careless with words. What I didn't understand yet was that my stability, the very thing Arthur worked so hard to give me, had become a target. To Quentin, that pension wasn't my safety. It was an unused resource. Something he believed should be circulating, working for him, rescuing him from choices he didn't want to own. To me, it was the thin line between independence and fear. I was not living lavishly. I was living carefully. And for reasons I hadn't yet faced, my careful life made him angry. That is what I lost before he ever laid a hand on me. Not the money. Not the house. I lost the certainty that my own child saw me as a person whose life still mattered. Quentin wasn't born unkind. That's important for me to say, because it took me a long time to admit what he became. As a child, he was sharp, restless, always asking why things worked the way they did. He wanted more than what sat in front of him, more than what Willow Creek offered. Arthur used to say Quentin had a motor that never shut off. Back then, we thought it meant he'd go far. As he grew older, that restlessness hardened into impatience. He didn't want to build slowly. He wanted results that showed up immediately and loudly. When other young men were settling into jobs, Quentin talked about scaling, leverage, and timing the market. Every conversation carried urgency, as if the world owed him success and was late delivering it. His first venture was a tech idea that promised efficiency and speed. Investors came and went. The money vanished faster than it arrived. Quentin brushed it off as a learning experience. The second was a specialty coffee shop with imported beans and sleek furniture. It lasted less than a year. The third was real estate, pitched as foolproof, backed by confident language and borrowed optimism. Each time, he told us the same thing. This one was different. This one was guaranteed. This one would make everything right. What worried Arthur, and later, me, wasn't the failure. It was how Quentin reacted to it. He never paused, never reflected, never scaled back. Loss didn't make him cautious, it made him reckless. He doubled down, chasing what he called momentum. I began to see a pattern I didn't have words for yet. When things went wrong, Quentin didn't adjust his behavior. He searched for something, or someone, to absorb the impact. That someone slowly became me. After Arthur died, Quentin's marriage grew louder and more expensive. Tamsin liked presentation, labels, appearances. She spoke often about how things should look, especially to people who didn't know them well. I noticed how often their lifestyle seemed to outpace reality. New furniture replaced furniture that wasn't worn. Cars were traded in long before their time. Vacations were booked like obligations. When I asked gentle questions, Quentin grew defensive. He spoke about image, about keeping up, about the importance of projecting confidence. He said people trusted success when it looked expensive. What he didn't say, what I later understood, was that confidence costs money, and theirs was borrowed. Over time, Quentin stopped seeing his choices as choices. He talked as if events were happening to him, not because of him. Deals fell through. Partners vanished. Banks asked uncomfortable questions. And each setback sharpened something in him. His voice tightened. His patience thinned. His expectations shifted. He didn't come to me as a son asking for help anymore. He came as a man who believed my stability existed to correct his risk. He framed my careful living as excess. He talked about family assets as shared property, ignoring the fact that Arthur and I earned every dollar through years of early mornings and quiet sacrifice. What I couldn't admit then was that Quentin no longer saw limits as real. He believed persistence should overpower boundaries. That belief didn't stop at business. It followed him home. By the time I realized how deeply that thinking had taken hold, the son I raised had already rewritten the story in his mind. In his version, my pension wasn't protection. It was a solution he deserved access to. And I, without meaning to, had become the last obstacle between him and the life he refused to give up. The first time Quentin asked for money, it didn't sound dangerous. It sounded practical. He sat at my kitchen table, tapping his fingers against the wood the way he used to when he was nervous as a boy. He said a payment was delayed. A partner had backed out at the last minute. It was nothing serious. Just a short bridge until things smoothed out. "I'll pay you back next month," he said, already standing, already certain. I wrote the check without hesitation. I told myself this was what parents did when they could help. I told myself I was investing in my son's future. When he hugged me before leaving, I felt relief, not doubt. The second time came sooner. Another gap. Another urgent need. Another promise framed as temporary. By then, the language had changed slightly. He didn't ask if I was comfortable. He asked how quickly I could transfer the money. He spoke like someone managing a schedule, not someone requesting help. I still said yes. What I didn't notice at first was how the visits shifted. Quentin stopped calling just to talk. He stopped staying long after the money conversation ended. He'd arrive tense and leave relieved, as if my house existed to reset his balance. The checks grew larger. The explanations grew shorter. Then Tamsin entered the room. She never asked directly. She commented. She observed. She noted how quiet my life was, how little I seemed to spend. She said things like, "Ellie doesn't really go anywhere, does she? Or it must be nice not having financial pressure." Her tone stayed light, but the message settled heavily. My careful life was being measured and judged. Soon, Quentin stopped saying loan. He started saying family support. He spoke as if the money moved through me, not from me. When I hesitated, he reminded me of everything he was trying to build. He reminded me that success required backing. He reminded me that I was his mother. The house felt different during those visits. He looked around more, opened drawers he'd never touched before, asked casual questions about paperwork, about accounts, about where I kept important documents. When I changed the subject, his jaw tightened. When I said I needed to be careful, he laughed and told me I worried too much. The laughter didn't last. The first time I said no, it slipped out quietly. I told him I had medical expenses coming up, that I needed to plan ahead, that I couldn't keep giving money without knowing when it would come back. The room went still. Quentin stared at me as if I'd spoken a language he didn't understand. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue. He simply told me I was being short-sighted, that if I helped him now, everything would improve later, that I was holding everyone back by clinging to security I didn't need yet. From that point on, every conversation carried weight. When I answered the phone, I braced myself. When I saw his car pull up, my chest tightened. He began framing my refusals as betrayal. He spoke about responsibility, about legacy, about what parents owed their children. He never once asked what I owed myself. What hurt most was the shift in how he looked at me. Not with concern. Not with affection. With calculation. As if he were tallying something in his head, deciding how much resistance remained. I started locking my desk drawer. I moved copies of my statements. I caught him once opening a folder without asking. He smiled when I walked in, said he was organizing. I knew then that trust had already left the room. By the time I realized the money questions were no longer questions, it was too late to pretend this was normal family strain. Quentin wasn't waiting for permission anymore. He was testing limits. And he was getting closer to crossing them. The first time Quentin asked for money, it didn't sound dangerous. It sounded practical. He sat at my kitchen table, tapping his fingers against the wood the way he used to when he was nervous as a boy. He said a payment was delayed. A partner had backed out at the last minute. It was nothing serious. Just a short bridge until things smoothed out. I'll pay you back next month, he said, already standing, already certain. I wrote the check without hesitation. I told myself this was what parents did when they could help. I told myself I was investing in my son's future. When he hugged me before leaving, I felt relief, not doubt. The second time came sooner. Another gap. Another urgent need. Another promise framed as temporary. By then, the language had changed slightly. He didn't ask if I was comfortable. He asked how quickly I could transfer the money. He spoke like someone managing a schedule, not someone requesting help. I still said yes. What I didn't notice at first was how the visits shifted. Quentin stopped calling just to talk. He stopped staying long after the money conversation ended. He'd arrive tense and leave relieved, as if my house existed to reset his balance. The checks grew larger. The explanations grew shorter. Then Tamsin entered the room. She never asked directly. She commented. She observed. She noted how quiet my life was, how little I seemed to spend. She said things like, "Ellie doesn't really go anywhere, does she? Or it must be nice not having financial pressure." Her tone stayed light, but the message settled heavily. My careful life was being measured and judged. Soon, Quentin stopped saying loan. He started saying family support. He spoke as if the money moved through me, not from me. When I hesitated, he reminded me of everything he was trying to build. He reminded me that success required backing. He reminded me that I was his mother. The house felt different during those visits. He looked around more, opened drawers he'd never touched before, asked casual questions about paperwork, about accounts, about where I kept important documents. When I changed the subject, his jaw tightened. When I said I needed to be careful, he laughed and told me I worried too much. The laughter didn't last. The first time I said no, it slipped out quietly. I told him I had medical expenses coming up, that I needed to plan ahead, that I couldn't keep giving money without knowing when it would come back. The room went still. Quentin stared at me as if I'd spoken a language he didn't understand. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue. He simply told me I was being short-sighted, that if I helped him now, everything would improve later, that I was holding everyone back by clinging to security I didn't need yet. From that point on, every conversation carried weight. When I answered the phone, I braced myself. When I saw his car pull up, my chest tightened. He began framing my refusals as betrayal. He spoke about responsibility, about legacy, about what parents owed their children. He never once asked what I owed myself. What hurt most was the shift in how he looked at me. Not with concern. Not with affection. With calculation. As if he were tallying something in his head, deciding how much resistance remained. I started locking my desk drawer. I moved copies of my statements. I caught him once opening a folder without asking. He smiled when I walked in, said he was organizing. I knew then that trust had already left the room. By the time I realized the money questions were no longer questions, it was too late to pretend this was normal family strain. Quentin wasn't waiting for permission anymore. He was testing limits. And he was getting closer to crossing them. The first time Tamsin spoke directly about my finances, it was casual, almost friendly. We were sitting in the living room, sunlight spilling across the rug where I used to let Finn build his train tracks. I was folding laundry when she leaned back in the armchair, crossing her legs carefully, her tone light and measured. "Elara," she said, as if we were discussing the weather, "are you sure you remember everything about your accounts? Sometimes it's hard to keep track, isn't it?" I paused, linen in my hands. Yes, I remember perfectly well. She smiled like she'd expected that. Of course. It's just, sometimes it's easier if someone else can help. Maybe a joint account. Her suggestion hung in the air like smoke. A joint account. One signature instead of two. One name with the power to access what I had carefully saved. She didn't say it in a threatening way, but the implication was clear. She painted it as convenience, as help, but underneath, it was a small crack in the wall I'd spent decades building around my independence. I thanked her politely and moved to another topic, but the seed had been planted. I found myself double-checking my bank statements, comparing them to old ledgers I kept tucked in the desk drawer. I began noticing small details, phone calls that lingered too long, mentions of numbers that didn't belong to anyone else but me, questions about payments I'd already recorded. Each one felt like a shadow, a reminder that someone was watching, waiting, looking for the tiniest lapse. It wasn't just Tamsin. Quentin began echoing her suggestions in his own way. "Mom," he said one evening, leaning casually against the doorframe of my kitchen, "maybe it would be easier if you just let me handle some of the bills. I know it's complicated." The words were smooth, almost caring, but I heard the edge in them, the assumption that I couldn't manage, that my years of experience were insufficient, that my judgment could be quietly bypassed under the guise of convenience. Then came the hints about power of attorney. Never outright, of course. Always phrased as concern. "It's a lot to keep track of," Tamsin said softly one afternoon while I watered the garden. "Maybe we should think about getting someone to help if you get tired or forget something. You don't want to make mistakes that are hard to undo." Mistakes. Hard to undo. The phrases were light, almost affectionate, but I felt them like small pricks. Each one was designed to unsettle me, to make me doubt my ability to care for myself, to question whether I could handle what was mine. I started noticing how often my own words were questioned. I forgot small things sometimes, like a misplaced envelope or a phone call I meant to return. Each slip became fodder. Each error became proof in their eyes that I needed supervision. I began locking documents away. Not out of paranoia, but necessity. Pension statements, the house deed, copies of all correspondence. Everything was organized, numbered, tucked in a small safe hidden in the pantry. I moved papers around when Quentin or Tamsin were visiting, taking precautions that should have been unnecessary within my own home. Every precaution made me feel both clever and isolated. Clever because I was protecting myself. Isolated because it felt like preparing for a storm that I had not called forth. The quiet fear settled over me in unexpected ways. I would wake up in the middle of the night and check drawers, ensuring everything was where it belonged. I kept a small notebook by the bed, recording interactions that had caused unease. Notes about phrases, suggestions, small oversteps. Each entry was a reminder that the people closest to me could no longer be trusted fully, that protection now required vigilance and planning. Even simple tasks began to carry tension. Answering the door, sorting mail, balancing checkbooks. Everything was shadowed by the knowledge that someone else might be watching, waiting for a lapse. When Quentin or Tamsin appeared unexpectedly, my hands tensed. My stomach knotted. I realized that my home, once a place of comfort, had quietly become a stage where I was forced to guard not just my money, but my dignity. And yet, I could not show fear. I could not let them see that their words had power over me. So I locked drawers, stacked papers, and quietly reminded myself, this is mine. My work. My life. My choices. And no one, not even my own son, could take that away without consequence. This section ends with the tension fully established. The unease, the isolation, and the quiet, simmering fear that would eventually lead to confrontation. Finn was my lifeline in ways I hadn't fully realized until everything started to crumble around me. My grandson, my sweet, clear-eyed Finn, had always been attentive, but now his calls became more than a routine check-in. They were lifelines, reminders that someone still saw me clearly. He listened without judgment, without suggestion, simply hearing the tension that had grown thick in my home like smoke. He noticed things I tried to ignore, how Quentin's voice sharpened, how Tamsin's comments carried hidden edge, how the helpful suggestions often came wrapped in doubt or suspicion. Finn didn't lecture me. He didn't offer solutions before I was ready. He asked questions that allowed me to see the pattern myself. "Grandma," he said one evening, voice low over the line, "have you thought about what's happening here? This isn't just about money anymore, is it?" I admitted to him, quietly, that it wasn't. That it felt like control, like a strategy to wear me down. That it wasn't the son I knew anymore, but a version of him I didn't recognize. Finn didn't panic. He suggested, softly, that I document everything, keep records, and consider speaking with someone who understood these situations. That someone turned out to be Patrice Dubois, my neighbor and friend for nearly a decade. Patrice was sharp, with years in legal aid behind her. She had a way of listening that made you feel like your experience was not just valid, but actionable. When I told her what was happening, she didn't dismiss my fears. She named the abuse plainly, elder financial exploitation. The words were heavy but clarifying. They took the jumble of fear, uncertainty, and guilt and gave it shape. It wasn't me being overcautious. It wasn't me imagining malice. This was deliberate, illegal, and dangerous. Patrice taught me the importance of documentation. Every demand, every conversation, every slight, every attempt to undermine my independence needed a record. She advised me to keep journals, take photos of bruises or marks, save messages, and write down dates and details. This wasn't paranoia, it was protection. I realized that in this situation, my words and observations could hold weight in ways I hadn't anticipated. They could create a shield strong enough to defend not just my finances, but my safety. Even as I listened, part of me recoiled. Could I really report my own son? Could I put him in legal jeopardy, call in authorities, take steps that might change his life forever? The guilt was immediate, almost physical. I had carried him, nurtured him, taught him to speak, to read, to understand the world. Was this how it ended? With papers, phone calls, and a restraining order? Finn's voice, patient and steady, guided me through the swirl of emotion. "Grandma, what he's doing isn't normal. You've tried to protect him, tried to guide him, tried to help. But he's crossing lines. You're not betraying anyone by protecting yourself." And Patrice added, in her calm, matter-of-fact way, that reporting didn't have to be dramatic. It could be quiet, methodical. Evidence first. Documentation first. Safety first. She showed me how to create an organized record that, if needed, would speak louder than any argument. She explained what agencies could intervene, how the process worked, and what steps would ensure I remained in control of the situation. For the first time in months, I felt a small lift in the weight pressing on my chest. Hope. Strategy. A way forward that didn't rely on confrontation, didn't rely on courage alone, and didn't require me to face the escalating danger blindly. I realized that the strength I had quietly cultivated through years of careful living and observation could now be applied in a deliberate, legal, and safe way. Even so, the inner conflict lingered. Could I act before things escalated further? Could I reconcile the love I felt for my child with the necessity to hold him accountable? Finn reminded me that love didn't mean enabling harm. Patrice reminded me that silence could be dangerous. And I reminded myself that safety was not selfish, it was survival. By the time I hung up the phone that evening, I had begun keeping a detailed log of interactions. Every phone call, every visit, every attempt at coercion was recorded. I labeled documents, placed copies in safe spots, and started planning the appointments Patrice had suggested. My home, once quietly tense, now had a purpose. I wasn't just waiting for danger. I was preparing to meet it with clarity and authority. For the first time in weeks, I felt relief. Not the naive relief of thinking everything would be fine automatically, but the relief of having a plan. Validation that what I experienced was real, serious, and actionable. And trust, not in my son, not yet, but in the people guiding me and, crucially, in my own judgment. This was the moment I realized that protection didn't require surrender. It didn't require fear. It required preparation, awareness, and the quiet, deliberate choice to act. And once I made that choice, I knew the next time Quentin tried to push, he would face someone ready, someone steady, and someone who could stand in his way without losing herself. The day Quentin arrived, I knew immediately something had gone terribly wrong. His car wasn't just in the driveway, it was skidding to a stop, tires squealing lightly against the pavement. I was arranging papers at the kitchen table when the doorbell rang, urgent and harsh. My heart skipped. He came inside before I could greet him. No hello, no small talk, just the charged energy of desperation. His face was mottled with stress and frustration, sweat glinting on his forehead despite the cool autumn air. He carried himself as if the room itself were conspiring against him. "I need access to your liquid funds, Mom," he barked, slamming his hand on the countertop. The sound resonated through the kitchen, sharp and sudden. The real estate deal collapsed. "I'm facing a margin call. If I don't get 200,000 by tomorrow morning, we're ruined. Bankrupt. Everything's gone." I inhaled slowly. My hands rested lightly on the table, steadying myself. "Quentin," I said quietly, "I told you before. That money is my pension. It's for my care. I cannot give it to you." He froze, then leaned closer, his words rising to a roar. "Can't? Or won't? You're sitting on a mountain of cash, wasting away in this museum, while your only son is about to lose everything." His face contorted. Rage, panic, and a desperate sense of entitlement. I noticed the shift in his eyes, the momentary flicker of calculation beneath the chaos. He wasn't just asking. He was demanding, expecting, believing he had a right. "I told you, Quentin. I cannot," I repeated. Then he moved toward the pantry, where I kept a small, hidden safe. The one I had used for documents, pension statements, and the deed to the house. His hands fumbled as he searched. I followed quietly, watching the tension coil around him. He flipped through drawers, knocked over a stack of papers, and cursed under his breath. When he found the safe empty, his eyes snapped back to me. The room felt suddenly small, thick with unspoken anger. "You moved it." His voice was a growl. "You selfish old woman. Do you want us to be homeless? You're a burden, Ilara. A dead weight." I felt the words land like blows. Not just insults, but truths twisted into weapons. A burden. Dead weight. My chest tightened, but I didn't respond. Silence can sometimes be sharper than any reply. Then came the grab. His hand closed around my arm, squeezing roughly. Pain shot up my wrist, red and fierce. But it wasn't just physical. It was the violation of trust. The final confirmation that this man standing before me was no longer the child I raised. He pulled, trying to reach the hook where I kept the spare key. I didn't fight. I didn't plead. I met his gaze with cold, controlled emptiness. A part of me observed the scene as if from above, the desperation, the fear, the entitlement, while another part, smaller and steadier, remained unbroken. Suddenly, he let go. Perhaps he realized his physicality would not bend me, or perhaps he saw in my eyes the recognition that the relationship was over. He stormed out, slamming the front door, leaving the house echoing with silence. I clutched my wrist, throbbing with pain, but my heart was strangely still. I moved through the quiet, checking drawers, reassuring myself that the documents were intact. The house felt suspended in the aftermath of what had just occurred. Each creak of the floorboards sounded louder. Every shadow seemed to stretch. But the fear had a new clarity, one that didn't paralyze me, but sharpened my focus. Finn arrived moments later, his expression a mixture of shock and concern. He held my hand, feeling the heat of the bruising, the anger still simmering beneath my calm exterior. I explained everything, from the safe search to the words he had used. Finn's eyes were wide, but he didn't panic. He suggested we contact Patrice immediately, and I agreed. That evening, as I sat with my wrist elevated, the room silent except for the ticking of the clock, I reflected on the magnitude of what had just happened. Quentin had crossed every line. Not just demanding money, not just accusing, but touching, attempting to control, and calling me a burden. It was the physical culmination of months of psychological manipulation. The house held its breath with me. The papers were safe. The pension intact. But more importantly, the choice to protect myself had never felt clearer. I had reached the moment where action was necessary. The calm after the storm, the quiet that follows pain, had a weight all its own. This was no longer about generosity or compromise. This was survival. And in the silence after he left, I felt the strange, steady relief of knowing that I had not just endured, but had begun the first step of turning the tide. After Quentin stormed out, the kitchen felt impossibly quiet. My wrist throbbed, a steady pulse reminding me of the violation I had endured. For a moment, I simply sat, breathing through the sharp pain, letting the silence stretch around me. Then I picked up the phone and called Finn. "Grandma," he said, voice tight with concern. "Finn, it's serious," I whispered, trying to steady myself. "I need help. I can't handle this alone." He didn't ask questions. He didn't hesitate. Within minutes, he was on his way, and I could hear the low hum of urgency in his tone as he reassured me. "We'll get through this. Don't move anything. Just stay safe. Patrice is on her way too." Patrice arrived not long after, brisk and unflinching. Her presence had a grounding effect I hadn't realized I needed until that moment. She carried a small kit, camera, notebook, and folders. Her eyes assessed the kitchen, taking in the disarray, the tension, the papers scattered across the table. "Ellie," she said firmly, "we document everything. Every bruise, every mark, every word. The evidence is what will protect you." I let her guide me. We photographed the deep red imprint on my wrist where Quentin had grabbed me. Each image was precise, deliberate, capturing the shock of pain and the reality of assault. Patrice instructed me to note every detail. The exact time, the words he had shouted, his gestures, his movements. It felt strange, recording my own trauma so methodically, but each entry made me feel stronger, more in control. Finn helped by organizing the documents we had tucked safely away. Pension statements, ledgers, letters, emails, everything was compiled, labeled, and ready to support a clear narrative. Patrice explained how every detail mattered, how a record of consistent patterns could transform what felt like family conflict into concrete legal proof. Next came the call to the police. Patrice stayed by my side as we dialed, explaining what to say, how to describe the assault without exaggeration, and how to present the history of coercion and financial pressure. The officers who arrived were professional, methodical, and understanding. I handed them the photographic evidence, the organized documents, and the journal entries. They took notes with meticulous care, listening as I recounted the events. Quentin's escalating demands, his accusations, the words he had used, and the moment he had physically grabbed me. Even as I spoke, a part of me wrestled with discomfort. Reporting your own child is not easy, but Patrice reminded me that the law exists to protect victims, not to judge relationships. Every step we took framed the situation not as a family quarrel, but as a pattern of abuse, financial and physical. I felt the tension slowly shift, from fear and vulnerability to empowerment. Once the police report was filed, Patrice guided us through the next steps. We prepared the temporary restraining order, drawing on the evidence meticulously collected. Every note, photo, and statement became a shield, a legal structure ensuring that Quentin's actions would not go unchecked. The knowledge that this formal framework existed, that the law would now actively intervene, brought an unfamiliar clarity and relief. At that moment, I realized the difference between helplessness and agency. I was no longer waiting for Quentin to escalate. I had created conditions that protected me and limited his options. I had witnesses, records, and a plan. I had allies in Finn and Patrice, and I had a legal foundation that could not be swayed by his anger or charm. And yet, the fear lingered, faint but present. The fear that other families might face similar situations without realizing it, that elderly parents could be manipulated and harmed silently. That awareness, sharp and insistent, reminded me of the responsibility we now carried. Most families ignore warning signs, I said quietly to Finn as Patrice packed up her kit. Subscribe so you don't. The words felt heavy but necessary. I wanted anyone watching to understand that vigilance and action mattered, that silence or inaction could have consequences far beyond discomfort. In that room, amidst photographs, papers, and quiet conversations, I felt the first real shift. I was no longer a passive participant in Quentin's schemes. I had reclaimed my agency. I had begun the process of turning fear into action. And I knew, without a doubt, that whatever happened next, I was prepared. With the temporary restraining order in place and the APS report filed, the momentum of the situation shifted. The legal measures weren't loud or dramatic. They were deliberate, quiet, and utterly beyond Quentin's awareness. In a way, that silence made the anticipation sharper, like the pause before a storm. I spent the hours after completing the paperwork in a careful routine, moving through the house slowly, almost reverently. The sunlight drifted across the furniture, warming the worn cushions, illuminating the plants I tended to daily. Everything looked ordinary, calm, familiar, but beneath the surface of normalcy, a transformation had quietly occurred. The protection I had set in motion was real, tangible, and fully operational. Finn hovered nearby, pacing only slightly, his eyes frequently flicking toward the window. He had called in the details of the legal filings to Patrice, ensuring everything was verified, logged, and ready should enforcement need to act immediately. Even in his youthful impatience, there was a profound steadiness, a reminder that I wasn't alone in this, and that the wheels of accountability had begun turning. I walked from room to room, checking locks and documents one last time, sipping tea to steady my nerves. It felt strange to be so calm after the violent encounter earlier. There was a power in knowing that I had done everything right, that the situation was legally framed and that justice could proceed without me needing to confront Quentin again. Outside, the world continued in its normal rhythm. Leaves rustling in the wind, distant children laughing on the street, neighbors walking dogs. None of them suspected the drama quietly unfolding just a few blocks away. And most importantly, Quentin had no idea. He believed that after his outburst, the battle was over. He assumed I was broken, vulnerable, and would eventually give in. I reflected on the pattern of his behavior, the demands, the accusations, the escalating desperation, and realized how much of the power he thought he held was an illusion. He believed the money, the house, and my compliance gave him strength. He didn't understand that true authority doesn't come from intimidation, threats, or possession. It comes from preparation, clarity, and the law backing you when manipulation fails. The calm in the house was palpable, but it carried its own tension. Each moment I waited for what was coming felt like a silent countdown. I could almost hear Quentin scheming, imagining scenarios where he might overpower the situation. And yet, everything he counted on had already been dismantled quietly, systematically, and without his knowledge. I moved to the window and looked toward the street. The police hadn't arrived yet. It could be hours. Perhaps they would come sooner. Perhaps later. That uncertainty, the unknown timing of accountability, made each passing minute feel stretched and dense. It was a curious kind of suspense, the kind that sharpened your senses and made every ordinary sound feel like a signal. Finn spoke softly from behind me, breaking the silence. "He thinks he's finished, Grandma." I nodded, feeling a quiet satisfaction. He truly believed that the power he'd wielded in the past, his anger, his words, his threats, was enough to bend reality in his favor. What he didn't know was that the system we had engaged was already in motion. Justice doesn't always arrive in the flash of fury. Sometimes it moves slowly, deliberately, invisibly, and that's what makes it so effective. I sat down with my tea, trying to appear composed. My wrist throbbed lightly, a reminder of what had occurred, but it no longer carried panic or helplessness. Instead, it served as a symbol of endurance and preparation. I knew the outcome was no longer in doubt. Quentin's next move, or lack thereof, wouldn't matter. The consequences were already written in the legal filings and the structured response we had assembled. The day stretched, calm but expectant. Outside, the light shifted, the shadows lengthened, and the quiet hum of normal life continued, a stark contrast to the storm that had erupted earlier. I was ready, steady, and resolute. The anticipation wasn't anxiety anymore, it was vigilance, mixed with a silent, inevitable sense of satisfaction. He thought I was finished. But in truth, the quietest preparation often yields the most profound consequence. The law was watching. The documentation was complete. The authorities were informed. And in just a matter of time, Quentin would learn that control can be taken away without a single argument, without a shout, without chaos. The morning air was crisp, carrying a chill that made the leaves on the trees tremble. I sat by the window, tea in hand, watching the familiar street outside. Finn was beside me, restless yet composed, eyes scanning every movement beyond our fence. Neither of us spoke much. The anticipation itself was thick, almost electric. Then, I saw them. A police cruiser turning onto our street, lights muted but purposeful. My heart skipped, not with fear, but with a strange, steady certainty. These officers weren't coming for me. I knew that immediately, even before they pulled up to the wrong house first. Quentin, oblivious to the documentation, the restraining order, and the APS report, had assumed he was untouchable. The officers approached his front porch with precision. The neighbors, drawn by the quiet but unusual presence of law enforcement, began to watch from their windows and doorsteps. A hush fell over the cul-de-sac. There was no chaos, no shouting from our side. Only the faint murmur of curiosity, the soft crunch of shoes against gravel, and the rustle of leaves in the wind. Quentin opened the door, hair disheveled, suit rumpled, the confident composure he normally projected replaced with visible tension. His eyes widened as he noticed the officers standing firmly at the threshold. What's this?" he stammered, voice rising into a pitch that betrayed panic. They didn't waste words. One officer handed him the documents, warrants, formal notifications, and an official statement citing the APS report and the legal filings for elder financial exploitation. Quentin glanced at the papers, then back at the officers, voice quivering. This is a mistake. Nothing. This isn't right." I watched from the window, gripping Finn's hand tightly. The quiet street held a rare tension, a mix of relief, expectation, and silent vindication. Quentin's wife, Tamsin, appeared in the doorway behind him, her expression shifting from disbelief to the slow dawning of comprehension. The mask of composure she usually wore cracked in real time. The handcuffs were applied with procedural care, firm but not unnecessarily harsh. Quentin's protests diminished into stunned silence as the reality of his situation sank in. He wasn't negotiating, he wasn't charming, and he wasn't manipulating. For the first time in months, or perhaps years, he was powerless in a way that couldn't be mitigated by anger or entitlement. I caught his gaze as the officers led him toward the cruiser. Our eyes met for a brief, jarring moment. There was recognition there, but not the recognition of a mother to a son. It was the acknowledgement that his actions had consequences that could no longer be ignored, that the web of manipulation and aggression he had spun around me and my home had been dismantled silently but effectively. The neighbor's eyes followed him, a quiet chorus of observation that magnified the weight of the moment. Quentin looked small, deflated, and entirely exposed. The luxury he had clung to, designer clothes, flashy car, the illusion of control, meant nothing in the face of documented evidence, law, and preparation. I felt the surge of emotional release I had anticipated. It wasn't triumph in a loud, celebratory sense, but the satisfaction of a quiet, undeniable victory. Justice had arrived, not through vengeance, not through confrontation, but through strategy, clarity, and unwavering adherence to the law. Finn squeezed my hand, a small, supportive gesture, and I realized the moral clarity of the situation. I had acted not out of cruelty, but out of necessity. I had protected myself, preserved my home, and ensured that abuse, physical, emotional, and financial, was confronted decisively. As the cruiser pulled away, carrying the consequences Quentin had long avoided, I felt the deep, calm relief that comes when fear has been met with action. The morning light, once ordinary, now seemed infused with purpose. Every leaf on the trees, every whisper of wind, carried the quiet resonance of accountability. In that moment, I understood the full power of preparation and legal protection. I had not only defended myself, I had reclaimed dignity, authority, and peace. The lesson was clear. Power can be abused, but it can also be restrained, guided, and corrected. And when the right steps are taken, even the most unexpected justice arrives with an elegance that words cannot fully capture. After the handcuffs clicked and the cruiser drove away, a stillness settled over our home. The adrenaline that had kept me alert since Quentin's outburst gradually ebbed, leaving a gentle, weary calm. Finn and I moved through the kitchen together, cleaning up the scattered papers and rearranging what had been knocked over. It felt ordinary, but in the quiet, I could feel the significance of the morning pressing against the edges of normal life. I reflected on what had just happened. Quentin had been arrested not only for the physical assault but for the serious implications of elder financial exploitation. Patrice had explained it to me simply. The law recognizes when someone deliberately manipulates or coerces an older adult into giving up money or property. The charges meant the authorities would investigate thoroughly, and Quentin would be held accountable for the pattern of abuse he had enacted over months, not just the single violent incident. It wasn't about revenge. It was about ensuring protection, setting boundaries, and delivering consequences that he could no longer evade. Finn's presence beside me felt grounding. He had been my anchor through this ordeal, offering calm and perspective, reminding me to focus on facts and preparation rather than fear or anger. "Grandma," he said quietly, "you did everything right. You stayed calm, you documented everything, and you acted strategically. You didn't just survive. You ensured justice worked in your favor." His words carried weight. There was no triumph in boasting, no desire for vengeance, only the acknowledgement of careful, deliberate action. That was the true victory, not seeing Quentin suffer, but seeing fairness applied and my safety secured. The knowledge that the authorities were involved, that legal measures were in place, brought a profound sense of relief that I had not felt in years. I glanced around the house, the familiar objects bathed in soft afternoon light. The garden outside, the photographs of Arthur and our life together, even the kitchen table where I had been assaulted hours earlier. Everything seemed unchanged, yet somehow different. The home that had felt vulnerable now felt fortified. Not by locks or alarms, but by clarity, preparedness, and adherence to law. There was no celebration. That wasn't appropriate. No champagne, no loud exclamations. Instead, there was peace, the kind that comes from knowing you acted correctly in a morally complex and frightening situation. I felt the tension in my shoulders ease, my wrist a dull ache rather than a sharp reminder of fear. The air seemed lighter, the room more open. I thought about the choices I had made, documenting the abuse, consulting Patrice, contacting Finn, filing the police report, and initiating the legal processes. Each step had been deliberate, each choice a way to reclaim control in a situation that had threatened to consume me. Looking back, I realized that acting decisively and with foresight had not only protected my physical and financial well-being but also safeguarded my dignity and autonomy. Finn busied himself quietly, organizing files and helping with the last details. I watched him and felt a swell of gratitude. In the midst of this crisis, we had relied on each other, he with his vigilance and support, I with the careful execution of each step needed to secure safety. It reminded me of the importance of trust, and of having allies who are reliable when the stakes are highest. Sitting in the living room, cup of tea in hand, I allowed myself a moment to simply breathe. Relief settled around me like a soft blanket. The fear that had shadowed my days was now replaced with clarity. Quentin's actions had consequences. The abuse he had inflicted would not go unchecked. And, most importantly, my future, my home, my finances, and my peace of mind was safeguarded. As I reflected, I realized that the truest lesson lay not in the drama of the arrest or the shock of confrontation, but in preparation, vigilance, and moral resolve. Justice had been applied, not through force, but through careful planning, legal support, and unwavering adherence to right action. That clarity brought comfort in a way that celebration never could. If you've experienced warning signs like this, don't wait, I whispered to Finn, the words extending to anyone listening. Most families ignore red flags. Subscribe, so you never feel helpless. In that quiet, with the afternoon sun soft on the walls, I felt a peace that had eluded me for far too long. The struggle was over, the threats mitigated, and a future of safety and dignity had been reclaimed. This wasn't victory in the dramatic sense. It was the profound, steady triumph of survival, foresight, and justice. The house was quiet now, and the tension that had gripped me for weeks had softened into a measured calm. I sat in my favorite chair, the afternoon sun spilling across the cushions, and allowed myself to reflect, not on anger, not on betrayal, but on what I had learned. The true victory wasn't in seeing Quentin handcuffed. It wasn't in witnessing his shock or the judgment of the law. The victory was in reclaiming my dignity, protecting what was rightfully mine, and asserting boundaries that no one, not even my own child, could cross. For so long, I had questioned myself. Was I being too harsh? Too cautious? Too suspicious? But now, clarity emerged from that fear. Protecting myself and my resources wasn't betrayal, it was survival. I hadn't acted out of malice. I hadn't sought revenge. I had acted with careful thought, guided by law, moral clarity, and the determination to preserve the life my husband and I had built together. In standing firm, I realized I was upholding the values he and I had cherished. Strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes, it is the quiet ability to stay composed when others are loud, to act decisively when others assume inaction, and to set limits that safeguard your life without sacrificing your character. I had learned that strength isn't measured by confrontation alone, but by foresight, planning, and the courage to act in the face of fear and uncertainty. The lesson extended beyond my own story. Families, even loving ones, can fracture when boundaries are ignored, when selfishness masquerades as entitlement, and when vulnerability is exploited. Standing firm doesn't sever ties unjustly, it preserves the possibility of respect, accountability, and ethical engagement in relationships. Protecting yourself is not a rejection of love. It is an affirmation of your right to exist safely, fully, and independently. Finn remained at my side, quietly supportive, a reminder that solidarity matters, that allies in difficult times can amplify courage and provide reassurance. His presence reinforced the idea that strength often manifests in collaboration, in thoughtful support, and in ensuring that decisions are informed rather than impulsive. To anyone watching, this is the takeaway. Safeguarding your life, your resources, and your peace does not make you cruel. Setting boundaries does not make you weak. Acting to prevent abuse does not make you disloyal. True strength lies in the balance between compassion and vigilance, between love and protection, between patience and decisive action. I would love to hear your thoughts. When faced with a loved one who crosses lines of respect or decency, what would you do? Comment below and share your perspective. And for those who are still considering subscribing, ask yourself, if this happened in your family tomorrow, would you want to be prepared? If you're not subscribing yet, tell me why in the comments. Let's start a conversation about courage, responsibility, and protecting what truly matters. This moment is not about celebration or revenge. It is about reflection, dignity, and the quiet strength that comes from standing up for yourself when it matters most. It's a reminder that boundaries are not walls. They are shields, and using them wisely preserves the life and peace you deserve.